Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be in Australia, although I have to say every time I come here I get sick. So if I make those kind of sounds that, when you're sitting on an airplane and the person next to you is sick and it drives you crazy, just bear with me, okay? Let me give you just a little bit more of my background, because so I was a journalist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a PhD. I have a hard science background in physics and engineering, and then I learned in the beginning, I started as a science journalist, and I learned that there's terrible science out there, just like there's terrible plumbing and terrible doctors and terrible tailors. There are also some pretty bad scientists who don't know what they're doing, and these scientists, if they're not checked, can infect an entire field. So my first two books were about physicists and then chemists who discovered non-existent fundamental phenomena, and I became obsessed with this question of how hard it is to do science right and how easy it is to get the right answer. And I had a lot of fans in the physics community, and after my second book, my second book was called Bad Science. And my physicist friends said, if you're fascinated with bad science, you should look at this stuff in public health. It's terrible. So I moved into public health in the early 1990s, and it was indeed as bad. Everything I had learned about how rigorous and methodical and critical and skeptical you have to be to even have a reasonable chance of getting the right answer in public health were considered luxuries they didn't have time to do because people are dying out there and we have to act. So by the late 90s, I stumbled into nutrition. My first piece was on dietary salt and high blood pressure. I spent 9 months on this one article for the journal Science. I interviewed 85 researchers for one article and read all the relevant literature. And while I was doing that, one of the worst scientists I ever interviewed in my life, and I thought I had interviewed like the worst, one of the 5 worst, took credit not just for getting Americans to eat less fat, but getting us on, or less salt, but getting us on the low-fat diet as well. And I literally got off the phone with this guy, and I called my editor at Science, and I said, this is clearly one of the worst. You can tell a bad scientist if you're in the business, just like if you're a reader, you can tell a bad writer. I said, one of the worst scientists I've ever interviewed just took credit for getting us to eat this low-fat diet we've all been eating, and I don't know what the story is, but I'm going to pursue it because if this guy was involved in any substantial way, I know there's a story there. The method I had learned in the 80s from my physicist friends were that bad scientists never get the right answer. It's just too hard to do. And so I spent a year on that article, and then I moved into obesity and everything that's followed. That's a setup. So let me, disclosures, I get book royalties, honorarium, and CrossFit, the athletic movement, supports me for reasons I don't quite understand, but I'm grateful. No, it's great. They want to make people healthy. Athletically healthy, nutritionally healthy, intellectually healthy, and so they've been supporting a lot of us. The context is, we talk about this like diets, and we get confused, and we think, the arguments in the press, or should you be on a low-carb diet or a low-fat diet, but there is a much more profound context, which is what Margaret Chan, the former Director General of the World Health Organization, in a famous 2016 address, called the slow motion disaster of obesity and diabetes epidemics worldwide. So these epidemics manifest themselves in virtually every population in the world when they transition from whatever their indigenous diets are to Western diets and lifestyles, and it tells us that there's something about these diets and lifestyles that are obesogenic and diabetogenic. So in 1974, as Jan pointed out, 105 million adults worldwide were obese, and by 2014, 40 years later, the number had increased 6-fold, and it's probably doubled since then. And what was more interesting than this to me in this lecture, which was to the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, she gave a probability of keeping a bad situation from getting much worse. So what she meant by that is a probability that health organizations like her own would not be able to reverse this epidemic, but just curb it, slow it down, keep it stable. And her answer was virtually 0. She was predicting, with almost complete certainty, total failure into the future. And with a scenario like this, if this was any other epidemic situation, what you would want is people saying to the public health, you would want the public health authorities saying to themselves, maybe we don't understand this disease state. Maybe there's something about obesity and diabetes that we got wrong. You know, if this was HIV and AIDS and you discovered the HIV virus in 1984 and you can't curb the spread of the disease and the incidence increases 6-fold in 40 years, people would be saying maybe it's not the HIV virus. Maybe we missed something, right? So this is what Rod was talking about. As a journalist, I stumbled into this and I started basically being the person who said, let's assess the underlying assumptions, and I had a bias, which was I knew these people didn't know how to do good science, you know, because I had been steeped in these bad scientists. And then Nina Teicholz came along after me, asking the same questions with the same basic lack of bias going in. We didn't have a horse in this race. We just wanted to know what the truth is, and we had the journalist skepticism that maybe people screw up because people screw up all the time. So the key thing here is this question, what is it that causes obesity? What's the, you know, and we've had this conventional wisdom now. Fundamental cause of obesity and overweight is an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended. And the medical community says, well, we know it's not that simple. But the reality is they don't. They'll talk about multifactorial complex diseases, and they'll put up graphs with arrows going everywhere to society and socioeconomic factors and personal factors. And this is 2017. The Endocrine Society scientific statement was co-authored by more than half a dozen researchers. It was 31 pages long. From a thermodynamic perspective, it is clear that obesity is generally the consequence of small cumulative imbalances of energy intake and expenditure, okay? It's an energy balance disorder is a phrase you hear in the medical literature. Calories in greater than calories out. We overeat. That's, you know, the biblical terms would be gluttony and sloth. And a lot of the researchers, by the way, out there, I would say virtually all of the research in the field is aimed at trying to figure out why we overeat. So they don't try to figure out, as Rod said, why somebody might have an affinity for accumulating fat and someone else doesn't. They try to figure out why somebody has an affinity for eating too much or not being able to say no to donuts and somebody else doesn't. It's a fundamental, this is the Newton's law of obesity, okay? And this is what this hypothesis looks like. Too much food, too little physical activity causes overeating, energy in greater than energy out, and the result is the obesity and the obesity epidemic. It's also the root of all fat shaming. A lot of you said you lost a lot of weight, right? So you were heavier. And the implication for why you were heavier is because you ate more and exercised less than your lean friends. Okay? It didn't matter how much you ate, how little you ate, or how much you exercised throughout your life. The implication of this hypothesis was you personally failed to be in energy balance when your lean friends succeeded. And that's the root of all fat shaming. Okay, so Hans Krebs, Nobel laureate, in his memoir of his advisor, Otto Warburg, a Nobel laureate, makes the same point I made. He said, students sometimes comment that because of the enormous amount of current knowledge they have to absorb, they have no time to read about the history of their field. But a knowledge of the historical development of a subject is often essential for a full understanding of its present-day situation. So on Thursday, I gave a talk at the University of Sydney to about 50 researchers and students. And I asked them how many of them knew the history of their Newton's laws of obesity, and not a single one raised their hand. Actually, one did, because she had read my books. Okay. By the way, from one thing I forgot to say, I like to give both. I think it's vitally important that we pay attention to positive evidence and the negative evidence. We have a tendency to only really want to pay attention to the evidence we believe. When I made fun of this scientist, who was the worst scientist who ever lived, or one of the 5 worst I'd ever interviewed, who took credit for putting us all on a low-fat diet, and he gets credit for it, he celebrated his 100th birthday a few weeks ago. And his mentor also lived to be over 100. I mean, you can't, I don't know. Okay, I forgot, I wanted to say that and I forgot. Okay, so this is a hypothesis. That's the point. This is a hypothesis. It's not chiseled on stone tablets and handed down from the mountaintop. It's not a direct consequence of the laws of physics, although the people who believe this hypothesis think it is. And it has an origin, and the origin is fascinating, and you always have to understand the history, because if you want to know what you're talking about in a subject, you have to know the origin of the ideas that you're discussing, and you have to know the competing hypotheses at the time, because you have to know if the ideas that you've embraced were actually based on compelling evidence, and what other ideas might have been based on more compelling evidence, but were rejected along the way because of political. And this is always how I've approached my research. You just keep going back in time. So what's interesting is, the birth of modern nutrition science begins in 1866 with this machine. This is a room-sized calorimeter. Well, it's a calorimeter in this case that's big enough to house a dog. And a calorimeter is a device that allows you to measure oxygen consumption and CO2 respiration. Then from that, you can calculate how much energy the animal expended. So a century earlier, they figured out you could calculate the energy in a food by burning it in a bomb calorimeter and seeing how much it heats up. And now they can calculate the energy expended by the animals that are eating the food. And by doing so, they can now measure energy in and energy out. And for the next 60, 70 years, all of nutrition science is vitamin and mineral content, protein content, some discussion about insoluble carbohydrates, fiber, and energy in, energy out calorimetry. By the late 19th century, early 20th century, everyone is doing calorimetry. That's the fad. And one of the things you have to know about science in any subject is the technology available determines the questions you can ask. If you can only measure one thing, you can only ask a question about that one thing. And if you're a good scientist, you're aware that that one thing you're measuring might not be the key thing. So you don't want to get locked into a hypothesis based on what you could measure, because there might be other things you can't measure that are more important. This is what they could measure. So by the early 1900s, they come up with a hypothesis promoted by Karl von Noorden, who's a leading German authority in diabetes, based on energy in and energy out. You can't think of a way that vitamins and minerals and fiber and protein might relate to obesity, but energy in seems natural. They've also worked out the laws of thermodynamics in this time. They've determined that the laws of thermodynamics apply to humans as well as animals. So more energy in. So this is von Noorden's statement of Newton's law. We'll call it von Noorden's law from here on in. The ingestion of a quantity of food greater than that required by the body leads to an accumulation of fat and to obesity should the disproportion be continued over a considerable period. Okay, and then Louis Newberg comes along. Louis Newberg is a University of Michigan physiologist. He is to von Noorden what Huxley was to Darwin, if you guys know your evolution. So von Noorden put this idea out and then moved back into diabetes, and Louis Newberg took it and ran with it. And by 1929, Newberg wrote his first paper on obesity based on studies of 4 people and said beyond a shadow of a doubt that obesity is caused by excessive intake of food. But he acknowledged that there could be people who don't eat excessive intake, so they must have a lessened outflow of energy. Okay, so all obese people overeat. There is no hormonal endocrine cause of obesity. It's always taking in more food than you expend. But the problem with this hypothesis is simple. There's a lot of them which I'm going to discuss, but the first one is once you inform an obese person that they've gotten fat by overeating, why don't they adjust? Okay, clearly all they have to do is eat less and exercise more, and we'll look at the size of that effect, how little they have to adjust. And you have to explain that. Newberg knew he had to explain that. So his answer to this question, why don't obese people compensate by eating less or exercising more, is because they suffer from, quote, various human weaknesses such as overindulgence and ignorance. This is one of the kindest ways Newberg put it. When you read the obesity literature from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, with our 21st century perspective, it is shocking how condescending and sexist and, I don't know, pick your adjective, they were, because they always had this problem. They knew what caused obesity, and they couldn't get obese people to lose weight. And I put this photo of Newberg in here because I think this is how lean people naturally think. Okay? And it's one thing I'm going to try and do in my next book, which is lean shame people. Well, because here's the thing. If you're lean and you know the secret to obesity, and you're lean and you eat in moderation, you're not a glutton and you're not slothful, you exercise. Back then you would have walked to work faithfully. Your assumption is if everybody did what you did, they would be lean too. The famous cognitive behavioral economist Richard Kahneman had a concept he called what you see is all there is. Why see Addy? And that's how we see the universe. What we see determines how we think about it. That's what I meant when I said the technology you have available determines the questions you could ask. So if you're lean and you know the secret to obesity and you tell people this is what they have to do and they fail, you got to explain it, right? So clearly they don't care as much as you do, or they're not listening to you, or they pick your shameful characteristic. Okay, so he took a problem that was based in the stomach. This is what this full energy balance hypothesis does. And it puts the ultimate cause of the problem in the brain. And all of modern obesity research, all of mainstream obesity research since the 1930s has been aimed at trying to find a way to explain why obese people eat too much without actually blaming them. So you blame the socioeconomic status, or you blame the food industry, or you blame ultra-processed foods, or you blame genetics for making them not have willpower. You try to find some way to blame us without actually fat-shaming us. But it's ultimately all fat-shaming. So why do they believe it? Well, because they knew that people like Falstaff had this zest for life as he ate Mrs. Twomley out of house and home. I mean, this is the ultimate basis of their belief. And they knew that if you starved people or rats or rodents, you could get leaner people or rats or rodents. And I've had multiple of these researchers tell me there were no obese people in Auschwitz. Again, even in the late 1990s, early 2000s, saying things that made me want to stick needles in my eyes. Okay, so the size of the effect. How small is this cumulative energy imbalance? It's vitally important also in science to understand exactly what it is we're trying to explain and to quantify it if possible. It's one thing to say you should eat less. The question is how much less. So weight management, you know this, it's all about balancing calories in, calories out, as the CDC says. Back in the old days when you went to the gym and you got on the elliptical machine, you looked at how many, like you'd do like 300 or 400 calories before you'd allow yourself to get off, right? Because you were trying to balance intake to expenditure. And if you were like me, you went outside, drank a 32-ounce bottle of Gatorade because you were soaked in sweat and never lost a pound. Okay. So that's 20. We asked the question, how many calories do I have to store in my fat tissue every day to gain 20 pounds of fat a year? So if I mean 2 pounds of fat a year, 20 pounds a decade. So if in my early 20s I'm lean, and by my early 40s I'm obese, I'm 40 pounds overweight, how many calories did I store in my fat tissue that my lean friends who remained lean did not? What's the difference between us? So we're storing 2 pounds of fat a year, and a pound of fat is roughly 3,500 calories, and it's a very simple calculation. It's 2 pounds times 3,500 calories per pound of fat divided by 365 days. And the answer is every day you were storing 19 calories of fat in your fat tissue that your lean friends weren't. If you gained 100 pounds in those 40 years, you were storing 50 calories a day that your lean friends were not. That's the difference, okay? So this is a bite of food. It's 2 peanuts worth of fat, 4 olives worth of fat, 2 gummy bears. In the US, we had our obesity epidemic is 30 pounds since 1960 per capita. That's about 5 calories a day. That's half a gummy bear. Okay, that's what's been stored in our fat tissue every day. Everything else is irrelevant. That's what we want to understand. Why is it some people store 2 gummy bears worth of fat in their fat tissue when they eat 2,000, 3,000 calories a day? It's a 0.007% positive energy balance. Eugene, I first saw this calculation done by von Noorden, 1905. Then Eugene Dubois was the leading authority on metabolism in the US. His seminal textbook, Basal Metabolism in Health and Disease. This says 1936, but since I wrote this slide, I got the 1926 edition. It's in there. He does his calculation. Actually, he does a different version of it. He says if you want to remain lean, you have to be in perfect energy balance. Okay? You cannot err at all, because every day's error accumulates into excess fat and obesity. And he says, considering that fact alone, there's no stranger phenomenon in the maintenance of a constant body weight under marked variation in bodily activity and food consumption. How can we possibly do this by having our brain regulate intake and expenditure? What is it measuring? And by the way, people think they'll give you answers, but they don't think in terms of how small this effect is. The ideas were hormones like ghrelin and NPYY and leptin are signaling to our brain how much fat we have and how much fat we're eating, and then they're telling our body how much to expend to balance it out. Further shortcomings. Okay, there are a lot of shortcomings of this hypothesis. The first is genetics. Okay, we've known forever that obesity has a large genetic component. It was first documented in the 1930s by an Austrian researcher I'm going to discuss. So the twin on the right is, the pair of identical twins on the right are clearly obese, and on the left you have a lean pair. And our energy balance hypothesis might tell us why the obese pair have a BMI over 30, because they ate too much, but it tells us nothing about why they have the identical bodies. Okay, right? Identical twins don't just have the same faces. If they're raised in the same environment, they have almost the identical bodies. I mean, they have the identical bodies if they're raised separately. In adoption studies, they have almost identical bodies. So what is it about our bodies that make us store fat in very specific ways that are independent of how much we're eating or exercising? There are sexual variations. And by the way, I apologize for these photos. These are from pre-World War II European textbooks, because the pre-World War II European researchers thought it was very important to understand. They didn't really care that much why rats got fat. So they didn't have pictures of fat rats. They wondered why humans got fat. And when you want to know something about a subject, you want to know everything about that subject. So they wanted to know when they got fat and where they got fat. And actually having pictures in case studies they considered valuable, because then they could start explaining singular cases. And from singular cases, they could, I always forget if it's induce or deduce what's going on in general. So men and women fatten differently. Okay, men get fat above the waist, women get fat below the waist. The guy who got fat above the waist here doubled his risk of heart disease. But our calories in, calories out, energy imbalance tells nothing about why this happens. Why did this guy get fat above the waist, and why did he double his risk of heart disease when she didn't? We need a theory that can explain that. You can think of it as a theory of adiposity, of fat accumulation, rather than just obesity. Because if it's fat accumulation, we want to know the wheres and the whens of it, as well as the whys. If it's obesity, you just want to know if somebody has a BMI over 30. So puberty is another example. Boys and girls enter puberty with roughly the same amount of body fat. They both get bigger through puberty. They both grow taller. They both eat us out of house and home. The boys lose fat and gain muscle, or at least they used to. And the girls gain fat, and they gain fat in very specific places. Okay? And by the time the girls get out of puberty, they have 50% more fat on their bodies than the boys do. So puberty for a woman is an adipogenic phenomenon. It stimulates fat formation. It stimulates fat formation in a very specific place, where for men it's the opposite. So clearly we know this is driven by sex hormones, and they knew this 100 years ago. And if sex hormones are determining where and how you put on fat and muscle, maybe they're determining how and where you put on too much fat or too little muscle. So energy balance, this is the key. This is a mistake that was made that still stuns me. I mean, I cannot believe this, and yet I've been writing about it for 20 years. Energy balance is a tautology, not a hypothesis. So what that means, what a tautology is circular logic. Okay, so let me give you this example of circular logic. Why do we get fat? Because we're overeating. That's what the hypothesis tells us. The problem is there's nothing you can measure to tell someone they're overeating. So how do you know they're overeating? Because they're getting fatter. In fact, if you're 50 pounds overweight and you have been 50 pounds overweight for 20 years or 10 years, you're not overeating. You're in energy balance. So why do we get fat? We're overeating. How do we know we're overeating? Because we're getting fat. And why are we getting fatter? Because we're overeating ad infinitum. There's no explanation buried in here for anything. There's a tautology. If someone's getting bigger, they're taking in more energy than they expend. The question is, why are they getting bigger? So remember this. This is another way to think about it. The fundamental cause of obesity and overweight is an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended. Imagine you came to the Gold Coast, not to hear talks about low-carb diets, but to hear how to enrich yourself. And I was a famous economist, and I'm going to give a talk about wealth and wealth disparity and how to beef up your pension plans and retire here instead of... And this is what I said. The fundamental cause of wealth is a money imbalance between dollars earned and dollars spent. Dollars in greater than dollars out. If you make more money than you spend, you'll be able to retire. But you got to make a lot of more money than you spend. Okay, not just a little. And I can't tell you how to do that because my hypothesis doesn't include information on why Bill Gates got rich and we didn't. Okay? But this is the exact same logic. I mean, I'm turning it into a joke. It is the exact same logic. And in economics, it's a joke. You're laughed out of the room. In obesity, it's the only allowable explanation. It's surreal what happened. Every time I hear the word overeating, I reach for the knitting needles. Okay? It's not a hypothesis. It's not an explanation. It is nothing. And actually, we use it. It's very hard not to use it because even in myself and my colleagues, you find yourself talking about excess carbohydrates. Well, what are excess carbohydrates? That's when you're eating too much of them. How do you know you're eating too much of them? Because you're getting fatter. Right? So the tautology is everywhere. And one of the things I try to do rigorously is never use that phrase, but it's difficult. But in this case, it became the baseline hypothesis in the field. So there was an alternative. This is what I learned doing my research. I had no idea this existed until about 2003, about a year into my work. So in this alternative, you start with first principles. It's another lesson in doing good science. You know, you've heard that phrase, never assume, it makes an ass out of you and me. Well, in science, you can't assume either. So if you call obesity an energy balance disorder, you're assuming that you know the cause of it. If you say, if you're a physician and an obese person walks into your office and you just look at them and think these people have too much fat on them, they have a fat accumulation problem. Or excess. For here, we could use the word excess. Obesity is sort of excess fat accumulation. It's first principles. And as I'll walk you through, gluttony and sloth are compensatory effects. This also had a history, and a very powerful one. German-Austrian hypothesis pre-World War II. The leading authorities, who would have known Karl von Noorden, by the way, and von Noorden actually talked about this hypothesis in one of his early books and kind of dropped it. Kind of forgot he ever raised it as far as I could tell. So Gustav von Bergmann was the leading German authority in clinical internal medicine pre-World War II. And the most prestigious award in the German Society of Internal Medicine or Clinical Medicine is the Gustav von Bergmann Medal, still today. And Julius Bauer was a pioneer in the field of endocrinology and chronic disease at the University of Vienna, which is one of the great universities in the world pre-World War II. And if you have any friends who are Austrian biologists, they probably know Julius Bauer's name. He was that respected. So this is how Bauer put it. And to understand this phrase, you have to see in the second sentence in the middle, there's this word lipophilic. So lipophilic means love of fat, and it was a word they needed to define a characteristic that they thought was important, vitally important, which was, you could think of the sexual variations. Men get fat above the waist, but the world is full of men with pot bellies who have skinny little legs, okay? And women get fat below the waist, and the world is full of women who have, are overweight below the waist and have skinny little tops, and there's clearly something about the tissue itself that determines whether or not it's going to accumulate excess fat. And they knew this. There was a case that von Bergmann wrote up about a young girl who had a bad burn on the back of her hand, so they took a graft of skin from her stomach and put it on the back of her hand, and then she grew up to be obese, and she had a huge tuft of fat on this hand and none on this hand. So clearly there was something about the tissue that allowed it to accumulate fat when other tissue didn't. And this they described as lipophilia. So it's just a character, just like we have some parts of our body that we grow hair and other parts we don't. And we don't have a word for that, but we should, or maybe there is and I don't know. Their thought was there are some parts of our body where we accumulate fat and some we don't. They need that term. So like a malignant tumor, like the fetus, the uterus, or the breast of a pregnant woman, the abnormal lipophilic tissue seizes on foodstuffs, even in the case of undernutrition. It maintains its stock and may increase it independent of the requirements of the organism. A sort of anarchy exists. The adipose tissue lives for itself and does not fit into the precisely regulated management of the whole organism. A lipomatous subject may die of starvation and still remain lipomatous. That's how they phrase it. So some people are more lipophilic than others. That's what he means by lipomatous. And we don't know what just as some tissues are, and just as some people are hairier than others. And we don't know what that is. He didn't know what it was determining it. But by the late 1930s, this theory was catching on. It required a textbook from Germany being translated into English in 1933. And once it did, American thinkers could start thinking about it. Newberg didn't like it because he did his work in 1929 and had declared definitively that obesity was caused by eating too much. So a textbook comes along in 1933 that starts airing this idea. Newberg's resistant. But other researchers, Russell Wilder was the leading authority on obesity and diabetes at the Mayo Clinic. He said the effect after meals of withdrawing from the circulation, even a little more fat than usual, might well account both for the delayed sense of satiety and for the frequently abnormal taste for carbohydrates encountered in obese people. A slight tendency in this direction, remember like 20 calories a day, 10 calories a day would have a profound effect. The hypothesis deserves attentive consideration. And Hugo Roney, who was a Hungarian endocrinologist who came to the US in the late 1920s and was working at, I think it was Rush Medical School in Chicago, or Northwestern, wrote the first monograph on obesity in the American literature, and he said it's now more or less fully accepted, chiefly in Germany. That was 1940, and the problem is 1940 was a very bad year, particularly for German and Austrian researchers. And this hypothesis vanished with the war. So pre-World War II, the lingua franca of medical science is German. If you want to be a serious medical researcher, you have to at least read German. Ideally, you speak it and have spent years studying, mentoring with German, Austrian, European researchers. Post-World War II, the lingua franca becomes English, and many fields of medical research are reconstituted from scratch by young American researchers who fought in the war. America is the only country in the world that has the money to fund research. The rest of the world is rebuilding. And we recreate all these fields from scratch. And Louis Newberg's work, Louis Newberg was the American, he was the only one whose ideas carried across the war. And I could actually document that. But the interesting thing is, beginning in the late 1930s, researchers created animal models of obesity. And in every single one of these animal models, it supported this idea that obesity is a hormonal regulatory defect. This picture is not one of Jean Maillet's. Jean Maillet was the leading nutritionist in the US in the 1960s. He was at Harvard in the 1950s. He worked on a fat strain of mice. He knew they were genetically predisposed to gain fat. And he said these mice will make fat out of their food under the most unlikely circumstances, even when half starved. So they don't get fat because they eat too much. They get fat if they eat at all. And if you remember, Bauer talked about independent of the nutritional state of the animal. So even if you half-starve these animals, every animal model of obesity shows us the researcher has to be smart enough to think, okay, I see the animal getting fatter and I see the animal wanting to eat a lot, but what happens if I control for its overeating? And I don't let it eat any more than a lean animal. I basically do to the animals what we did to ourselves growing up when we were 30 or 40 or however many pounds, kilograms heavier. And they find that the animals get fat anyway. It's built into their genes, and that's endocrinology. So if obesity is a sort of excess accumulation of fat, a hormonal regulatory disorder, the question is what regulates fat accumulation? This is what Bauer didn't know, because he didn't have the technology to do it. Once again, the technology allows you to ask different questions. So in 1960, this, by the way, is how Hilda Brooke phrased that same thought. Hilda Brooke was the leading American authority, the leading American authority on pediatric obesity in the mid-1920s. She said, looking at obesity without preconceived ideas, one would assume that the main trend of research should be directed towards an examination of abnormalities of the fat metabolism, since by definition, excessive accumulation of fat is the underlying abnormality. First principles. It so happens this is the area in which the least work has been done. So in the 1960, Rosalind Yalow, a physicist, and Solomon Berson, a physician, published the details of a new assay, a new technology called the radioimmunoassay that for the first time in history allows researchers, medical researchers, to measure accurately the levels of hormones in your bloodstream. Yalow in 1977 wins the Nobel Prize for it, and Berson has died by then, so he can't share it with her. And the Nobel Prize gives him credit for creating a revolution in medicine and a revolution in endocrinology that passed the field of obesity research by. Because the obesity research by 1960 was dominated by psychiatrists and psychologists who were trying to teach fat people how to eat less. Okay, and they didn't care about endocrinology. But between 1960 and 1965, we worked out what hormones dominate this process of fat accumulation, and it turns out to be insulin. As Yalow and Berson said, insulin is a principal regulator of fat accumulation, and it inhibits fat mobilization. It's a principal regulator, inhibitor of fat mobilization. So when you raise insulin levels, you store fat. That's what insulin does. It's telling your lean tissue to burn carbohydrates, and it's telling your fat tissue to hold on to fat. And the release of fatty acids from fat cells requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. That's a phrase I'm going to come back to. If you want to get fat out of your fat cells according to endocrinology, you got to get insulin down. So this is how Yalow and Berson put it in 1965. This is a hypothesis. We generally accept that obesity predisposes to diabetes, but it's not mild diabetes predisposed to obesity. Since insulin is a most lipogenic agent, they could have said the most lipogenic, but they weren't sure about that then. Chronic hyperinsulinism would favor the accumulation of body fat. And in Yalow and Berson's very first paper, they demonstrated that obese people and type 2 diabetes, people with type 2 diabetes all had elevated insulin. They identified insulin resistance. And once they realized they had elevated insulin, they said, well, if their insulin's elevated all the time, they're storing fat all the time. Maybe that's why they're obese. Okay, here's the key points of fat cell regulation. When insulin is secreted, chronically elevated fat accumulates in the fat tissue. When insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissue and the fat depots shrink. That's textbook medicine, and we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbs in our diet. That's also textbook medicine. And one of the people I interviewed for this was George Cahill, who did some of this work in the 50s, and in 1965 co-edited a 600-page American Physiological Society handbook on fat tissue metabolism. And I called him up in 2005, and I said, look, are all these things true? And he said, yeah, carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat. That's true. And the interesting thing is, so that's textbook medicine, but if you take out the word is driving insulin, you have carbohydrate is driving fat, and now you have quackery. Because a calorie is a calorie, and we all get fat because we eat too much. And it doesn't matter what we eat too much of. So you have something that's all textbook medicine, each step along the way, and you take out 3 words and you end up with quackery, even though it's the logical equivalent. Here's how it looks in a textbook. Leninger's is the most authoritative biochemistry textbook in the US. If you go to the index and you look up fat accumulation and adipocytes, which are fat cells, it tells you that high blood glucose, which you get from a carb-rich meal or being insulin resistant, elicits the release of insulin, which speeds the uptake of glucose by tissues, favors the storage of fuels as glycogen, which is the storage form of carbs and triglycerols, while inhibiting fatty acid mobilization in adipose tissue. So if you want to get a fat cell fat, you raise blood sugar and raise insulin. If you want to make somebody fat, there's a section on obesity in this book. They eat more than they expend. This paradigm is so powerful, it's so wrong, that even people who understand the biochemistry and the endocrinology still think in terms of people get fat because they eat too much. So here's the alternative hypothesis. Like any growth defect, obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder. So like any growth defect, if you saw somebody walking in the room who was 8 feet tall, You don't care how much they eat and exercise, regardless of how heavy they are or thin. You're concerned that they have a tumor in their pituitary gland that's making them oversecrete growth hormone. And if this person's sister is only 4 feet tall at full adult height, you know they've got a growth hormone deficiency or a growth hormone receptor deficiency. They're very simple problems. Okay, and they may or may not be solvable, but you know that there's one fundamental hormone, and this hypothesis, the same thing happens when you're getting too heavy. So like type 2 diabetes and its association is so close to type 2 diabetes that some people like me think of them as two sides of the same coin. It's fundamentally a disorder of insulin signaling. There are other hormones involved, sex hormones, like I said, glucagon, growth hormone. They'll all tell you something about the problem. But you could get about 80 to 90% of the understanding by focusing on insulin, and it's triggered by the carbs. So it's not all carbs. It's not green leafy vegetables, which are actually very low in digestible carbohydrates, but sweets, which are half glucose, half fructose. The fructose is metabolized particularly in the small intestine, the liver, and we've made our small intestines and livers take on the job of metabolizing huge amounts of fructose all day long, which they didn't evolve to do. And then my belief is that's the cause of insulin resistance. That's a hypothesis, but if you're insulin resistant, you oversecrete insulin to all the carbohydrates at the base of this food guide pyramid, which are all the foods we were told to eat in the 1980s and 1990s because we were avoiding saturated fat. So that could explain the obesity epidemic. So here's a hypothesis: refined grain starches and sugars cause dysregulation of insulin signaling, excess fat accumulation, obesity, and the obesity epidemic. It's a very simple hypothesis. The implications are interesting. The conventional wisdom is that all diets that result in weight loss do so on one basis and one basis only. They reduce total calorie intake. And the alternative hypothesis is they do so on one basis and one basis only. They reduce circulating insulin. They create the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. And the only way to do that is restricting carbs or not eating at all, which we're all pretty good with. Should any of this be surprising? And again, the conventional wisdom into the 1960s was this: farinaceous and vegetable foods are fattening, and saccharine matters are especially so. Farination is old-fashioned word for starchy. Okay, a line like this is in virtually every medical textbook from the late 19th century through the early 20th, including some of the most famous medical textbooks. This is a line I use in every one of my books. It's from the British Journal of Nutrition. First sentence, co-authored by one of the 2 leading British dietitians. Every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. This is a piece of common knowledge which few nutritionists would dispute. So what our medical community did with their belief that saturated fat causes heart disease and their fear of heart attacks is they transformed the carbohydrate from something that was inherently believed to be fattening, that every woman knew went right to her hips, and they turned it into a heart-healthy diet food in the course of many of our lifetimes. So when I grew up, Thursday night was pasta night in my family. My mother was born in Brooklyn, New York, and she was a Jewish, but she might as well have been Italian, and we had wonderful pasta only on Thursday night because it was fattening. By 1988 or so, pasta night was every night. Bagels were Sunday. Bagels were every day. It's just how we changed. I mean, there's a New York Times had a food writer named Jane Brody, famous food writer. She's still working today. And her 1985 best-selling book was the Good Food Book, or the subtitle was Living the High Carb Life. And she said, we used to think pasta was fattening. Now we know it's a heart healthy diet food. So, and then you could find diets. I went back, you could find diets in the literature, diets for obesity. I found 5 of them in the late 40s and early 50s published from Harvard Medical School, Cornell Medical School, Stanford Medical School, Rush in Chicago. And this one, Raymond Green was the leading endocrinologist in England in the mid-19th century, mid-20th century. Was a brother of the novelist Graham Greene, for what it's worth. And this is, I find this fascinating because they were all this, variations on this, but mostly this, foods to be avoided. This was before understanding of insulin and fat accumulation: bread, cereals, potatoes, foods containing sugar. And you can eat as much as you like of the following foods: meat, fish, birds, all vegetables, eggs, cheese, fruit, except with the exception of some of the fruit. This is the Atkins diet. This is keto. And what I find interesting is he's not talking about grams of this or percentage of that. The foods on the left are fattening. Don't eat them. Okay? And this is a message we haven't given anyone from the 1960s. If you are predisposed to get fat, these are the foods that trigger it. May not be able to stop it entirely. There may be other hormonal influences that are, but these are the foods that trigger it. They are literally fattening. And if they're making you fatter, you will crave them, and then you'll be hungrier. And the other foods are not fattening. You can eat as much as you want. It's like, you know, I can eat an apple. Well, I'm not going to eat an apple. I can chew on a coffee stirrer and not worry about getting lung cancer. I don't smoke cigarettes because cigarettes are carcinogenic. That's a lousy metaphor. I do chew on coffee stirrers because I used to smoke cigarettes. Okay, the catch, and then we're done. Why keto? The medical community is legitimately afraid of extreme dietary interventions, okay? Ketosis, ketones were first identified in the urine of uncontrolled diabetics who were dying of their disease in the 19th century. This scares medical researchers, and any extreme intervention seems to come with more risk than a more moderate intervention. The first law of medicine is do no harm, not do good by your patients, it's do no harm. So the medical community is absolutely right in being scared of our message, okay? So why do we believe this is necessary and maybe even unavoidable for many people? So back in the 1990, a group of University of Texas, Ralph DeFranzo's team. Ralph DeFranzo was the only researcher, one of two research groups in the world that could do this measurement. Again, the measurement is crucial. What they wanted to know was how fat accumulation, fat storage, and fatty acid oxidation responds to the hormone insulin. So what they knew is a phrase I heard all the time, that fat cells are exquisitely sensitive to insulin. And what I'm going to tell you is, what does that mean to be exquisitely sensitive to insulin? That means through the whole range of fat, so here's insulin going up, and throughout this whole range of insulin secretion, the fat responds to the insulin and holds on to fat, and the lean cells respond to the insulin and burn carbohydrates. So remember, the insulin is in the bloodstream to tell the lean tissue to burn carbs and the fat tissue to store fat. And the fat tissue, even after the lean tissue becomes insulin resistant, the fat tissue remains sensitive to the carb. In fact, one argument is it's only when the fat tissue becomes insulin resistant itself does your weight plateau. But from here on up, you're storing fat because you're burning carbohydrates. So this is going down from high insulin, and then you get to a threshold, and it's like a switch has been flipped. And many of us have experienced this in our lives when we've gone to ketogenic diets. So below this point, your fat tissue starts dumping fat into the bloodstream, and your lean tissue starts burning it for fuel, because beneath that threshold, you are burning fat for fuel, and in theory, there's no carbs in your body to burn. If you're a type 1 diabetic, regrettably, you're below that threshold all the time, and that's why if you didn't take insulin, you would be starving and emaciated because you'd have no insulin to secrete. So the message of this is, if you want to get fat out of your fat tissue, below that threshold is a negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. That's where you have to be, and the longer in the day you're below the threshold, the more fat you're burning and the less fat you're storing, and you could think of it as a sort of 24-hour balance. So during the day when we're eating, we're above the threshold. We want to be storing fat because we're going to burn it at night when we're sleeping, so we don't have to get up to eat. As our insulin levels go up, we shorten the time that we're burning the fat, and we lengthen the time that we're storing it, and we start accumulating fat every day, a little bit at a time, accumulative imbalance, and depending on our predisposition, it could be 20 calories a day, it could be 50, it could be 100. So we have to be below that threshold. The only way you really know you're below the threshold is if you're in ketosis. You could be below it anyway, but the sign that you're below it is ketosis. That's the logic for the ketogenic diet. Getting under that threshold and staying under that threshold. If you do intermittent fasting, my feeling is you're just extending the period you're under the threshold, that you're burning fat. whether that's 18 hours a day or over the course of 48 hours. So what's interesting, just to tell you the end of this, by the 1960s, diet doctors got onto this, particularly Atkins. And they weren't diet doctors, they were people like us who were struggling with their weight, and eating less and exercising more didn't help, and actually did some research to see if there was something they missed and stumbled on this same science. And so Atkins was the most prominent. He found that he lost weight when he restricted carbs. He recommended to his patients. He went through the same conversion experience that many of us do, which of course biased the medical community against him forever. And he became very popular and very rich with his book, and the medical community went after him. Not the whole medical community. There was a group of obesity researchers that controlled the field on the east coast of the US who tended to know Atkins. So this paper was actually written by his chief resident as a cardiologist who knew Atkins and didn't like him, okay? And then a nutritionist at Harvard, and the people at Harvard don't like to think they don't know everything. It was published under the auspices of the Council on Foods and Nutrition, the American Medical Association. The Harvard nutritionist was working for them at this point as their nutritionist. And it was a critique of low-carb ketogenic weight reduction regimens, and it said low carbohydrate diets, I'm going to read from the bottom up, are bizarre concepts of nutrition that should not be promoted to the public as if they were established scientific principles. And yet, fat is mobilized when insulin secretion diminishes. And what they didn't say is that ketogenic diets, low-carb diets, are the ones that do the best job possible of diminishing insulin secretion, because that would be an argument to continue studying this and promoting it and perhaps making it mainstream. So from the 1973 to the end of the decade, the goal was to get rid of Atkins, who they legitimately thought was killing people because he was advocating a high-fat diet. So Atkins was the bathwater. And the science, so all the endocrinology, the hormonal enzymatic regulation of fat accumulation had to be tossed out with it. Because if we paid attention to it, you're led to eating less carbs and more fat if you don't want to be overweight. Okay, thank you. Thank you.